What allows a person to smile in the face of death, even without clinging to heaven and without leaning on metaphysical promises. In a quiet room in Edinburgh, when his body had grown thin and worn, and the final days of his life were closing in, like a lamp being turned down one notch at a time, David Hume still retained a rare calm. No panic, no lament, no attempt to seize one final answer to resist the darkness drawing near. He looked at the thing most human beings still fear the most, uncertainty, with a softly bright gaze, almost gentle, and perhaps it is precisely there that his story begins to feel more intimate to us than any page of philosophy ever could. For we, too, are living in an age of much noise. Many opinions, many absolute assertions. Everyone wants to speak quickly about what is right, who is wrong, what should be believed, and what must be rejected. But the more we listen, the more weary the human heart sometimes becomes. The more tightly we try to grasp everything, the more the mind can begin to tangle itself, like a room full of wind in which no door is willing to close. And then, from more than 200 years ago, a Scottish man walks toward us very slowly, carrying not the hammer of a destroyer, but only a small lamp of quiet doubt. He does not teach people to despair because they cannot know everything. He simply reminds us gently that perhaps we do not need absolute certainty to live decently. Perhaps we do not need to solve every mystery of the universe to sleep in peace. Perhaps a soul that knows how to accept its own limits is also a soul that is lighter, more tolerant, and more at peace. That is why tonight, on Deep Sleep of Power, we are not merely telling the biography of a philosopher. We are going to walk through the life of a human being who learned how to face uncertainty without becoming bitter, who looked directly at the illusions of reason and still preserved compassion for humanity, who doubted deeply, yet did not lose his joy in small things, a dinner, a conversation, a book, a quiet afternoon. If you love journeys like this, stories that are slow, deep, and gentle enough to carry the mind away from the last noises of the day, then please give Deep Sleep of Power a subscription as one very small way of accompanying the channel through long nights where history does not knock at the door with loud sounds, but with very soft footsteps. The story of David Hume does not begin in the elegant drawing rooms of European learning, nor with the books that would shake modern philosophy. It begins in a place farther away, lower, quieter, a place of grassy hills, mist, and little streams murmuring across the Scottish borderlands, where a silent boy grew up amid dogma, coldness, and the first questions no one could answer for him. There, in the mist-veiled landscape of 9 wells, the first streams did not merely run through the fields. They also ran through the deepest part of a mind just beginning to awaken. To understand why David Hume would later be able to look directly at the things human beings fear most without trembling, we must go very far back. Not back to the great books, nor yet to the debates that stirred Europe, but back to a low, damp, quiet, mist-laden land in the south of Scotland. That place was called 9 Wells, a small estate near the borderlands, not magnificent, not so wealthy as to leave people in awe, yet possessed of a very particular stillness, as though the land itself had no wish to speak too loudly of its own importance. The name 9 Wells came from the little streams that were always murmuring through the grounds, winding between wet grass, cold earth, and the rolling hills of Berwickshire. There, morning often arrived very slowly. The mist did not lift at once. The light did not come rushing in, Everything seemed to step out from the shadow so gently that one had the feeling nature in that place did not awaken by sound, but by breath. It was in precisely that atmosphere that David Hume grew up. He was born into a minor Scottish noble family, orderly, honorable, steeped in tradition, yet not affluent. It was the kind of family in which dignity was preserved with great care, even when money was scarce. When David was still too young to fully understand what loss meant, his father died, leaving his mother, Catherine Falconer, to raise the children alone. From then on, David's childhood was shaped not only by grassy hills, veils of mist, and little running streams, but also by the firm hand of a devout, disciplined, and deeply enduring mother. Catherine was not a weak woman. She belonged to the spiritual world of Presbyterian Scotland, where faith was not a soft ribbon laid gently across human shoulders, but was more often like a coarse woolen garment. It kept one warm, but it also rubbed against the skin. In that house, morality was not merely advice. It was discipline. Religion was not merely a refuge. It was the air surrounding each day of life. And for a sensitive child like David, that atmosphere created both structure and a kind of silent pressure, like cold mist seeping into one's clothes before one even notices. Perhaps Sunday was where that mark showed itself most clearly. Imagine a stone church in Churnside, cold and gray beneath the Scottish sky, long wooden pews, sermons dragging on for hours, words about original sin, judgment, punishment, and the smallness and fault of human beings before a severe sacred order. For many souls, that might have been the road to obedience. But for David, it is very possible that those heavy sounds gave rise to something else. Not noisy rebellion, but a quieter habit. The habit of asking questions. What is remarkable is that the seed of skepticism in Hume seems not to have grown out of arrogance. It grew out of observation, out of a sense that there was some distance between declarations made with too much certainty and the actual rhythm of human life, out of an early intuition that fear is sometimes dressed in the garments of truth, and perhaps also out of the very natural need of a child to find a gentler shelter in the world. While his brother John found joy out in the fields, in hunting, in the outward movements of youth, David often withdrew into another quiet realm, the family library. There were no long sermons, no judging eyes, only paper, ink, wood, and the silence of books waiting to be opened. That boy, in the midst of a world saturated with dogma, found the first refuge of his mind among those pages. It may well have been there, amid the smell of old paper and the pale gray light of Scotland, that David began to understand that the world did not speak in only one voice, that beyond the things adults declared so confidently from the pulpit, there were still other paths by which one might look, think, and feel one's way toward truth. And here lies the first beautiful paradox of Hume's life. It was precisely because he grew up amid a rigid discipline that he learned early to love the freedom of thought. It was precisely because his childhood passed through so many shadows of judgment that he began to long for a gentler kind of light. This light did not force human beings into absolute certainty, but invited them to become more humble before what they did not know. Nine Wells, therefore, was not merely a home. It was the cradle of a mind. It was the place where mist taught a boy that the world does not always appear clearly. It was the place where dogma taught him that words spoken with too much hardness sometimes need to be tested by doubt. And it was the place where the little streams murmuring through the cold earth accidentally sang the overture to an intellectual life, that would one day shake the foundations of European philosophy. But then, like every young stream, that mind could not remain forever in the old valley. One day, while still very young, David left behind the grassy hills and the family library to enter another labyrinth, the labyrinth of the city, of schooling, of thick academic walls, where the intellect was taught to follow worn paths before it was ever permitted to see the sky for itself. Leaving behind the little streams of 9 wells, David Hume entered an altogether different world. No longer the mist-damp grassy hills and quiet afternoons beside the family library, but Edinburgh, the city of grey stone, of narrow slopes, of rooftops crowded together like layers of thought piled up inside a mind that is not easily allowed to rest. There, everything seemed harder. The air was hard. The stone walls were hard. Academic discipline was hard as well. And within that setting, there was a boy of only about 12, still slight in figure, still far too young in years to bear the weight of grand declarations about truth, stepping into university as one steps into a forest that seems at first to be full of light, only to find the canopy growing denser with every step. At first glance, it may have seemed a path to be proud of. A boy sent to the University of Edinburgh, the intellectual centre of Scotland, a place so many families hoped their children might reach and then return from, was crowned with honour. To adults, it was the beginning of a future. To society, it was a sign of promise. But to David Hume, that place seems to have revealed itself early not as an open garden, but as a labyrinth with too many paths already laid out in advance. The lectures he heard were not meaningless. They had a system, tradition, and the authority of many generations behind them. But for that very reason, they also carried a kind of atmosphere that made the boy feel stifled. Too many conclusions already framed, too many truths placed upon a high platform before life itself had a chance to speak. Scholastic education at the time, with its mixture of Aristotle and theology, sought to teach people how to think inside a house that had already been built. But David, from very early on, seems to have felt something unsettled within. If thought becomes nothing more than the repetition of what has already been approved, then where does living knowledge remain? This was not the kind of rebellion one could see with the naked eye. David did not rise in the lecture hall to loudly denounce his teachers. He did not seek to become a young man of disturbance and noise. No doors were slammed. No rebellious speech was delivered. Hume's resistance was far quieter than that. Quiet as a stream silently changing course beneath the ground. He began to turn away, but he turned away very softly, while many of his contemporaries passed through university as if along a straight road toward profession, degree, and status. David gradually realized that his mind could not remain healthy within corridors so tightly closed. What he longed for was not victory within an old argumentative system. What he longed for was to touch truth as it appears in real life, where human beings feel, remember, misperceive, hope, fear, love, and persuade themselves of things that are not necessarily true. Perhaps that was the very early moment when David Hume began to become himself. Not when he published a doctrine, but when he understood that he could not allow his intellect to be shut inside the cramped rooms of repetition. From then on, his true teachers began to appear, not always in flesh and blood, but through pages opened in silence. Cicero came to him as a voice both classical and lucid, reminding him that philosophy is not meant to take one away from life, but to help one live it more wisely, more evenly. Virgil brought him something else, the beauty of language, the softness of rhythm, the sense that a great idea does not necessarily have to wear the heavy garment of authority. It may enter the human heart through beauty, through resonance, through a sentence subtle enough to be remembered longer than a speech. And then Pierre Bayle opened before the young Scottish man a land even bolder still, the land of skepticism, not the kind sharpened by bitterness, but the habit of not kneeling too quickly before any system that proclaims itself absolute. Those names were like lamps being lit in a room that had long been filled only with the dim light of dogma. David read, thought, and quietly stepped away from the path others expected him to follow. He did not pursue a degree as an ornament for his life. He did not regard a certificate as the final proof of knowledge. What he needed was something far more elusive, the freedom of independent thought. And here we begin to see clearly a trait that would remain with Hume throughout his life. He did not tear things down merely to be called different. He moved away from rigid patterns because they were not real enough for human lived experience. That is a very important difference. Some people oppose simply because they enjoy opposing. But Hume, even from a very young age, seems to have resisted because he wanted to find a path more honest to reality. But an honest path is not always a gentle one. Once a mind has tasted the freedom of questioning, it becomes very difficult for it to return and live peacefully among borrowed answers. And because of that, the fracture between David and the expectations placed upon him grew larger and larger, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently, like a small crack running through the heart of stone. His family still hoped he would follow a respectable course. Society had already prepared neatly labeled compartments for educated young men. But within him, another door had opened. The door leading toward philosophy, or toward questions, toward an intellectual life for which both body and soul would have to pay a price. And then, as though the body itself knew what the mind had not yet dared to say aloud, one day that silent tension began to turn inward, not through argument, but through exhaustion, through weariness, through a quiet crisis in a man trying to live a life that did not belong to him. Some rebellions do not begin with words. They begin with a nameless weariness, with mornings when one wakes and the heart feels heavy, like mist that has not yet lifted, with the feeling that the mind is still trying to go on, but the body is slowing down, like a carriage that has begun to hear the sound of cracking deep within its wooden wheels. For David Hume, after years of studying too early, thinking too much, and quietly moving against the path others expected him to follow, that rebellion no longer remained in the mind alone. It descended into the body. It was the period that Hume would later describe, when looking back, with a phrase at once strange and sorrowful, the disease of the learned. At first hearing, the phrase sounds almost elegant, but behind it, there was nothing poetic at all. It was genuine exhaustion. It was nerves drawn tight for too long. It was a mind trying to live in a direction that did not suit it, until the body had to speak in its place. Those who have passed through long years of worry will perhaps understand this very clearly. There are times when a person does not collapse because of one great event, but because too many silent strains have settled one upon another, like fine dust on a table. Each day only a little more, until the room can no longer breathe. In his youth, Hume had been expected by his family to enter a respectable profession, perhaps the law, perhaps some secure mode of life recognized by society. But the further he went, the more he felt he did not belong on that road. Within him was another pull: philosophy, thought, questions about human nature, about belief, about the limits of reason. Outside him, meanwhile, there were duties, standards, and the ready-made frames prepared for an educated young man. That tension did not produce an explosion. It produced erosion. Hume read a great deal, thought a great deal. He dug deeply into large questions while still very young. He did not study merely to know. He studied as a man seeking an escape for his own soul. But when a young mind tries too early to carry burdens that are too abstract, while lacking a balanced rhythm of life, lacking the light of ordinary living, lacking simple joys to lean on, then knowledge sometimes ceases to be a lamp. It can become a flame that burns back into the one holding it. At times, Hume fell into states of sadness, loss of vitality, and declining spirits. His body weakened. His mind seemed covered in mist. People did not know whether to call it a bodily illness, a mental illness, or simply a crisis of youth. But perhaps, for Hume, the name mattered less than this truth. He could not go on living as though nothing were wrong. And this is one of the beautiful yet painful moments in his life. For many people, they only hear the body once it has begun to scream. But Hume, amid that exhaustion, seems to have begun to understand something that would remain with him all his life. A human being is not a machine that will function better merely by being filled with more arguments. We are more fragile creatures than that. We are guided not only by thought, but also by habit, emotion, daily rhythms, small joys, small sorrows, and by what the eyes see and the ears hear every day. If life is bent too far away from one's true nature, then it is not only the mind that becomes unstable. The body, too, will speak. At a deeper level, that illness was like the body's quiet refusal of a borrowed life. It was as though the body were saying to that young man, "You cannot live only by the expectations of others. You cannot go on walking forever along the path the world calls proper, if inwardly you are withering more each day. You cannot use willpower to force the soul to remain inside a garment that has grown too tight." Many years later, Hume would become one of those who understood human beings with gentler, truer, less illusory gaze. Perhaps because he had tasted this very early on, we are not wholly rational creatures in the way we imagine ourselves to be. We are fragile beings, shaped by climate, by the body, by imagination, by memory, by the rhythm of sleep, by joy, and by worry. And to understand human beings, one must first stop imagining that human beings are nothing more than machines of reasoning. But in those dark days, that lesson had not yet emerged as a clear philosophy. It appeared only as a feeling of exhaustion, as a young man looking around and knowing that he could not remain forever in the room that was suffocating him. So, instead of continuing to force himself into a predetermined pattern of life, Hume began trying to save himself through very basic things, changing his rhythm of living, moving his body, eating regularly, stepping away from old pressures, and trying to place himself in a different environment. It was not a glorious victory. It was a necessary retreat, which sometimes in a human life is the quietest form of courage of all. There are times when, in order to find the right path, we must be willing to leave the path we are on. For Hume, the illness was not merely a period of collapse. It was the painful bridge that carried him from his family's expectations toward the true calling of his own life. From a life already arranged to a life he would have to feel his own way through. From the rigidity of learning toward a gentler understanding of the human being. And then, when the thickest mist of that crisis began to lift, even if only a little, another door opened, not in a lecture hall, but at a harbor, in a commercial city, where the young man who had wanted to live by thought would try to clothe himself in a profession wholly unsuited to his heart, before fate quietly led him farther still, toward France, toward solitude, and toward the book that would keep his name alive long after his breath had gone. There are turns in a human life that do not open with thunder. They open with a mild reproach, a closing door, an ill-suited job, a morning spent looking out at the harbor while knowing very clearly in one's heart, I am standing in the wrong place. After the collapse of his youth, David Hume did not immediately step straight into the life of a philosopher. Not everyone is brave enough to live at once in accordance with the deepest calling within. Very often, before daring to admit that one is different from the ordinary path, a person still tries one more time to become a normal person in the eyes of the world. Hume was no different. He came to Bristol as a final attempt to come to terms with life. In the early 18th century, Bristol was a bustling commercial city where ships came and went, goods changed hands, numbers, cargoes, commercial letters, and the smell of salt sea air pressed themselves into the rhythm of everyday life. It was a world very different from Nine Wells, very different from Edinburgh, and even more different from the inward realm of thought smoldering in the mind of that young Scottish man. In Bristol, one needed the quickness of the marketplace, the alertness of calculation, and a kind of attention directed outward, toward prices, shipping schedules, partners, profit. But Hume, even when he tried to place himself within that machinery, never truly belonged there. Perhaps he tried with complete sincerity. Perhaps he told himself that this was the moment to stop thinking such distant thoughts, to stop living among ideas, to stop letting his mind drift toward questions that could not help sell a pound of sugar or settle the figures of a shipment. But some natures will not lie still inside a garment that does not fit. The body may sit at the desk of a merchant, while the mind quietly goes elsewhere. Bristol, then, was not a failure because Hume was lazy. It was a failure because he could not turn himself into another kind of person by will alone. That image, if we dwell on it, is quietly sad. A young man who had already been thrown into crisis by forcing himself to live against his nature now tried once again to step into a form of life society regarded as proper, respectable, and practical. But amid the scratching of pens across ledgers, amid ships carrying sugar and other goods, amid letters full of concrete interests being exchanged, his mind still hovered somewhere beyond, over larger questions. How human beings believe, how they think, by what habits they live, what illusions they fall into, what hopes they cling to. And then the final moment of rupture arrived in an utterly ordinary way. His employer reproached him, saying that he wrote like a scholar rather than like a merchant. Had those words been spoken to someone else, they might have been nothing more than professional criticism. But for Hume, that sentence was like a key turning softly in a lock long rusted shut. It opened a truth he had perhaps always known in the depths of his heart, but had not yet been calm enough to name. He had not failed because he had not tried hard enough. He had failed because this was never the life meant for him. How strange it is that sometimes the world's refusal becomes the first grace fate offers us. From Bristol, Hume carried away no glory, no significant wealth, no fine title, only a truth that was becoming ever clearer. If he went on living that way, he would once again lose himself. And this time, instead of resisting that truth, He began to follow it. He left England and went to France. It was not a noisy departure, not the journey of a celebrated genius. It was more like a retreat into quiet. With a small inheritance enough to live frugally, Hume sought a place far enough from the expectations of his family, cheap enough to survive in, and quiet enough to think. He stopped in Flèche, a small town in Anjou, a place without display, without clamor, without demanding that he play any role other than himself. There, the rhythm of life softened. There was no longer the bargaining noise of the harbor, no more pressure to resemble a successful man in the ordinary sense. There remained only a small room, a writing table, hours of reading, walks, and that very necessary solitude for a mind trying to hear more clearly the voice rising from within. There are forms of loneliness that cause a person to wither, but there are also forms of loneliness like an abandoned garden after rain, still and silent, yet quietly preparing for something to grow. Flèche became such a place for Hume. There he began to live not as a young man seeking status, but as someone beginning a long dialogue with human nature itself. From his own experiences, a childhood under the shadow of dogma, a silent resistance within academic life, the illness of the learned, failure in the commercial world. Hume gradually realized that the greatest question was not how to fit the molds of society, but how to understand this strange being, the human creature, a being at once rational and unstable, at once fond of certainty and yet living by habit, at once drawn toward greatness and yet guided by the most fragile tremors of feeling. It was precisely in that almost impoverished simplicity that he began to hear the sound of his own life more clearly. Not the sound of fame, not the call of rank or office, but the sound of a work far deeper and more enduring. To write, to think, to observe, and to try to construct a new map of the human mind. Flèche gave him no medals, but it gave him something more precious, a stretch of silence wide enough that his talent no longer had to ask permission from the world to exist. And so, in a quiet room on French soil, the young man once criticized for being unsuited to commerce began to do the one thing only he could do. The pages thickened. The ideas began to connect. A silent intellectual dream slowly crystallized. Large, daring, and so far ahead of its time that it did not yet know that when it stepped into the light, the world would greet it not with applause, but with a silence colder even than the misty season of Scotland. Some failures arrive like a door slamming shut, but some failures arrive so gently that those outside almost hear nothing at all. No loud mockery, no spectacular collapse, only something placed into the world with all the hope a person possesses, and then left lying there with no one bending down to pick it up. That is what happened to David Hume when he was still very young. After those quiet months in Flèche, living frugally, reading much, thinking much, and gathering the full intellectual strength of his youth into one great work, Hume wrote the book he believed could open a new way of understanding human beings. A treatise of human nature. Not a small book written merely to test his hand. Not a scattered bundle of notes, but a very large ambition, almost so bold as to be reckless, to build a science of man, beginning not from lofty dogmas, but from the way the mind actually works. Sensation, memory, habit, belief, imagination, passion. A young man like Hume, without great fame, without a secure place in the learned world, yet daring to lay his hand upon a task of such magnitude. That fact alone already shows that within him there was a very quiet courage. Not noisy, but willing to think farther than others expected. And yet, when the book appeared, what awaited him was not resonance. It was silent, a very cold silence. The book was not immediately crushed beneath fierce attacks. What was more painful than that was that it was scarcely welcomed enough even to become the center of a major controversy. It entered intellectual life like a stone falling into a lake late at night. There was an impact, but too faint, and soon the surface grew still again, as though nothing had touched it at all. For someone who had poured into it the most important years of his youth, that feeling must have been bitter indeed. For there are people who can endure opposition, but very few can endure giving their whole heart and effort, only to remain unseen. Sometimes it is easier to be criticized than to be ignored. A rejection, at the very least, still acknowledges that one has spoken, but indifference feels as though the world is looking straight through us, as though what we have written is not yet weighty enough to make the air change direction. Hume once spoke of that intellectual child of his as a book that fell from the press and almost seemed to be born without ever truly living up to expectations. That phrasing, even if we dwell on it only lightly, still carries within it a deep sadness, a great intellect tasting helplessness before the world for the first time. Why did this happen? Partly because Hume had moved too quickly. He was still very young, yet he wrote like a man seeking to reset the foundations of all philosophy concerning human nature. Another reason was that the treatise was too dense, too substantial, too ambitious. It was not something that could immediately enter drawing rooms, conversations, or the everyday reading life of the educated public. It resembled a block of raw stone more than a bridge, solid, deep, but difficult to cross on a first encounter. And there was another subtler reason still. Hume was speaking about human beings in a way that made many people uncomfortable. He did not begin with an unchanging soul or with truths already guaranteed in advance. He began with something far nearer and also far more unsettling. That most of our mental life is not guided by pure reason in the way we imagine. That our beliefs grow out of habit, repeated experience, and the natural structure of the mind. It was a way of seeing that was at once new, lucid, and disturbing to the sense of certainty many people needed in order to live at peace. But at that moment, Hume had not yet acquired the calm distance needed to analyze it all in such a way. He knew only that the book he loved had failed to reach the world as he had hoped. Let us pause here for a moment and look more closely at this disappointment. For in the lives of those who work with the mind, writing, researching, thinking, teaching, this is a very real wound. We may endure poverty, solitude, and long silent years, so long as we can still keep the faith that one day our work will find the person who needs it. But when that work is born, and almost no one listens, then the question that arises is not only, why do they not understand, but also, was I wrong from the very beginning? Hume passed through that dark region, and it is precisely here that we begin to see a very precious quality in him. He did not allow his first failure to turn him into a bitter man. He did not withdraw into darkness with wounded pride, nor did he turn the silence of his readers into proof for despising the world. The pain was there, but it did not freeze him in place. On the contrary, it began to teach him something more important even than recognition. A true idea will not necessarily be heard if it has not yet found the right voice. This was a very delicate turning point in Hume's life. The failure of the treatise was not merely the failure of one book. It was his first lesson in the distance between intellect and communication, between what we wish to say and what others can hear, between the vast work constructed in the mind and the actual rhythm of human life. Hume, who had observed human beings so deeply, ultimately had to learn one more profoundly human lesson. To enter the human heart, truth requires not only weight, it also requires a form that knows how to breathe. Perhaps that is why, after that silent fall, he began to change. Not by changing his core, not by betraying his thought, but by changing his rhythm, his way of stepping forward, his voice. From the great stone mass of a system, he gradually learned to reach readers through smaller pieces, brighter pieces, pieces closer to life. As though after casting an entire boulder into the lake and seeing the surface remain still, he decided to begin again with smaller circles, spreading farther beneath the quiet light of evening. After his first great book fell into silence, David Hume did not abandon his ideas, but he began to understand something very important, something many writers, teachers, and thinkers only learn after many years. Thinking deeply does not mean others will listen deeply. Some ideas are true, yet they enter the world wearing a face that is too severe. There are truths of real weight, yet spoken in a voice too cold, too dense, too closed, so that the listener does not know where to place a hand to come near. Hume had tasted that reality through his own disappointment, and instead of shutting himself away in wounded pride, he did something far more difficult. He changed the way he spoke, not because he wished to flatter the world, but because he had finally looked directly at human nature, the very thing he would later analyze so deeply in his philosophy. Human beings do not live by pure argument alone. We live by rhythm, by impression, by habit, by conversation, by things that can enter the mind without causing the mind to contract. If one wishes to reach human beings, thought must sometimes know how to step down from the lectern, sit beside them at the tea table, and speak like an intelligent friend, rather than like a judge of truth. It was from that realization that Hume turned to the essay. This form suited him in a very beautiful way. It did not require him to erect an entire cathedral of thought, as the treatise had done. It allowed him to open many smaller windows, each one looking onto a different slice of life. Taste, morality, politics, habit, temperament, elegance, the subtlety of feeling, the rigidity of reason when cut off from ordinary living. And within those windows, Hume began to do what he would grow increasingly skilled at over the years, to say difficult things in a voice gentle enough that people would not walk away. This was not a matter of shallow simplification. Hume did not turn thought into something sweet as to hollow. He merely removed the overly heavy garment of systematic writing so that the idea could breathe, could move, could enter drawing rooms, coffee houses, dinner tables, and even those quiet evenings when a reader sits alone beside a lamp. Here, we see that he was not only a philosopher, he was also an artist of cadence. Hume's essays gradually gave readers the sense that philosophy did not have to stand at a distance from life. It could speak of commerce and remain gentle. It could speak of morality without lecturing. It could speak of politics without shouting. It could touch vanity, self-deception, and the small passions of human beings while still keeping a faint smile at the corner of its mouth. In him, intellect was no longer a sword always pointed outward. It became a lamp placed at the center of the table, helping everyone see their own face more clearly. This was a major step in maturity. After that first failure, Hume did not withdraw into becoming a writer only for ascetic minds. He accepted a deeply human lesson. If thought is to live long, it must know how to live among ordinary people. It must understand the joy of conversation, know the value of grace, and know that a lucid sentence sometimes travels farther than an unwieldy system. Perhaps for that very reason, he leaned more and more toward the kind of philosophy he himself would later distinguish from the abstruse and difficult, a philosophy still deep, but near enough not to leave people exhausted. In this, Hume seems to have gone far ahead of many writers of his time. He understood that if one wishes to speak of human nature, one cannot write as though human beings were sterile intellects. One must write for creatures who grow tired, who grow bored, who delight in a beautiful sentence, who remember longer what is said in a measured voice. And perhaps because of that, his style increasingly acquired a rare quality: intelligent without showing off its intelligence, sharp without harshness, subtle without making the reader feel looked down upon. That is why Hume's essays were not merely a turning point in his career. They were also the expression of a way of life. He began to believe more deeply that intellect should not imprison itself in an ivory tower. It is not enough for a person to think well. He must also learn how to enter the shared world of human beings, a world where there is laughter, prejudice, habit, and those small truths that are often more enduring than abstract concepts. The more Hume wrote essays, the more he resembled a man who knew how to sit closer to life. And how gentle it is to see an intellect once buried by silence, now slowly finding the tone that truly belonged to it. Not the tone of a conqueror, not the tone of someone who shouts to be noticed, but the tone of a man who understands that lasting persuasion comes not from pressure, but from brightness and warmth. Those qualities made Hume's prose easier to enter, but they also made his philosophy more humane. He was no longer concerned only with constructing a correct system. He was beginning to care about how human beings might actually live with such ideas. From there, something else also began to open. Once he had learned how to converse with the world in shorter writings, Hume began to see that he could do more than that. If human beings are only fully understood through habit, feeling, power, prejudice, and collective memory, then perhaps nowhere is this shown more clearly than in history. The conversations around small tables would soon lead him into a larger room where an entire nation would enter, bringing with it kings, parliaments, wars, religion, ambition, and fear. As though after learning how to listen to the heartbeat of individual human beings, he was now about to place his ear closer to the long movement of an age. After learning how to converse with the world through lucid essays, David Hume seems to have taken another step, from questions about the person to questions broader, longer, and slower, like time itself. Human beings do not live only in the brief present of their own lives. We also live in the shadow of earlier centuries, in habits left behind by those who came before us, in prejudices passed down through many generations, in conflicts that seem to have ended, yet whose echoes still travel through law, religion, forms of government, and even through the stories a nation tells about itself. Perhaps for that reason, to Hume, history was not merely old things. It was a long mirror in which human nature becomes clearer when we watch it repeating itself across the ages. And like many other turning points in his life, this shift did not arrive in the form of a grand display. it came through the library, in rooms full of books, amid the smell of old paper, the scent of leather bindings, the dim light, and rows of documents, silent as though holding their breath to preserve the memory of an entire nation. Hume found a space deeply suited to him. If, in his youth, he had once listened to the streams of 9 wells, he was now beginning to listen to another kind of current. The current of dynasties, civil wars, disputes between king and parliament, conflicts between religious factions and power, ambitions clothed in righteousness, and righteousness that sometimes carried ambition within itself. Not everyone who enters an archive hears history begin to speak. Many people see only documents, dates, names, and events. But Hume brought into the library a rare gift. He did not seek facts alone. He sought the patterns of human beings. He wanted to understand why crowds are so easily swept away, why power always tells its own story in a way more beautiful than the truth, why religion can console the soul, yet also ignite division, and why a nation so often remembers what serves its honor and forgets what unsettles it. At this point, the philosopher within him had never disappeared. It had merely changed clothing. It entered history still carrying the same old question: what sort of creature is the human being, really? When Hume set out to write The History of England, he was not merely taking on a task vast in scale. He was stepping into an intellectual and political minefield. Writing the history of England at that time was no neutral matter. It was a territory thick with partisan feeling. Every dynasty, every figure, every overthrow or restoration of power had already been wrapped in loyalties, prejudices, and prides of its own. To write about England was to touch England's nerves. One slight tilt of the pen, and the writer could immediately become an object of suspicion. But for that very reason, the task strangely suited Hume. He was never someone who easily believed stories that were too perfectly rounded. He did not like to idolize human beings simply because they stood on the side that had won. He did not hasten to kneel before national myths when the documents still allowed questions to be asked. From the foundation of his philosophy, Hume entered history with eyes lucid, cool enough, but not bitter. He tried to look at past centuries as an observer of the complicated movements of human nature, where ideals and interests are often entwined like creeping vines upon an old wall. What made Hume a memorable historian was not only the quantity of material he handled, but also the way he told it. He did not write history like a dry chronicle, merely piling year upon year and campaign upon campaign. He brought into it the rhythm of literature, the precision of reason, and above all, the ability to make centuries that seemed dead begin to speak again. Under his pen, kings were no longer merely stone busts. They appeared as human beings with strengths, blind spots, haste, vanity, talent, and limits. Institutions, too, were no longer abstract concepts. They became a stage upon which human beings attempted to arrange power without ever fully controlling its consequences. But something even more precious than that was this: Hume did not write to inflame. Even as he moved through civil war, struggles for power, executions, and restoration, he preserved a tone with a certain distance in it, a quality very rare in those who touch subjects of deep division, perhaps because he understood that history, if told only through anger, will make the reader burn hotter without becoming any wiser. But if told with sufficient composure, it may open for us a wider field of vision, one in which we begin to recognize the errors human beings repeat again and again, and therefore become less hasty in our present judgments. Of course, that way of writing did not please everyone. Hume was criticized. Some found him biased. Some could not accept that he did not tell history as they had come to love it. But strangely enough, it was precisely within that field of controversy that he grew weightier still. For a true historian is not one who satisfies every faction. He is one with enough courage to step beyond the ready-made feelings of his age, even knowing that the price will be the displeasure of many. And then, volume by volume, his history went out into the world, slowly but surely, like stones being laid one by one into a long bridge connecting England to its own memory. Reputation now came to Hume not only as an elusive philosopher but as a writer of history, a man able to make grey centuries vivid without turning them into a stage for exaggeration. There is a very deep beauty in this stage of his journey. The boy who once found refuge in the family library at 9 Wells, the young man once swallowed by silence when the treatise first appeared, now sat within the greater libraries of the nation, listening to hundreds of years of history as though listening to a long conversation. It was as though life had taken him on a vast circle, only to return him to the thing he had always done best, to read deeply, think slowly, and then tell it back in a voice bright enough that the pod no longer remained a heap of cold ashes. But history, for Hume, was still not the final stopping place. For the longer he looked into the centuries, the more clearly he saw that behind every great event, throne, war, parliament, church, there remained a question more enduring than them all. What makes human beings believe that tomorrow will resemble yesterday, that fire will continue to warm, that the sun will rise again, that the world possesses a stable order on which we may lean? And from the midst of those long pages of history, his mind quietly turned back once more to the most familiar mystery of all, the way the human mind itself constructs certainty out of its own fragile habits. After passing through history, libraries, and the centuries full of the noise of power, David Hume brings us back once more to a place much smaller, so small that it could rest upon the tip of a finger. A flower petal. Try to imagine that tonight. A petal, thin, soft, slightly damp with dew. Its color appears beneath the lamplight not too vividly, only enough for the eye to recognize a shade of red, or a pale pink, or an ivory white leaning toward shadow. When we touch it, there is a smoothness. When we bring it near, there may be a very faint fragrance arriving and fading, as though it had never been there at all. And in that moment, before we even name the flower, before we think of a graceful description, before the mind begins to arrange and classify, something has already happened. We have felt. For Hume, that is where knowledge truly begins. Not from concepts too lofty and remote, not from solemn definitions, not from systems that wish to erect a castle of truth before. Looking down at the ground beneath it, everything that enters the mind, according to him, begins with what directly touches us: light, sound, taste, smell, pain, pleasure, heat, cold, color, movement, emotion, fear, and liking. Hume called these things impressions, those vivid, forceful, immediate experiences that come to us like a wave still full of the water's strength. And then afterward, when that direct moment has already passed, the mind retains a trace. We remember the color of the flower. We imagine its fragrance again. We think of the soft feeling at the fingertip when it touches the thin petal. But what remains is no longer as strong as it was at first. It is like an echo, growing gentler after the sounding of a bell, like a fragrance still lingering after the door has already closed. Hume called those parts ideas, fainter, softer, more distant copies of the original impression. At first hearing, this may sound simple. Almost anyone might nod in agreement without sensing anything startling in it. But if we move a little more slowly, we begin to see that Hume is doing something very deep. He is drawing philosophy down from the high heavens and placing it back upon the ground of experience. He tells us that before human beings make grand claims about the soul, the world, being, or eternal truth, we ought to be honest about the first question. What do we actually have in our minds? And where did those things come from? This is a gesture at once humble and bold. Humble, because it forces reason to admit that it does not generate everything out of emptiness. Bold, because it makes many familiar beliefs slow down. If every idea must be traced back to some impression, then whenever we use a large word, self, soul, cause, reality, God, matter, Hume will gently ask in return, what concrete image, what direct feeling, what vivid experience has given you that idea? If there is no sufficiently clear answer, then perhaps what we are holding is not certain knowledge at all, but only a shadow made of words. But the strange thing is that Hume does not say these things in the voice of someone who enjoys destroying for destruction's sake. He speaks like a man wiping dust from a mirror, without bitterness, without display, simply wishing human beings to see more clearly what they truly know and what they have merely grown accustomed to naming. Perhaps that is also why his thought, sharp though it is, still possesses such a strangely intimate quality, for all of us live in the world of impressions and ideas, though not all of us pause long enough to notice it. A rainy afternoon makes the heart grow heavy. An old melody brings memory back. The smell of hot tea recalls a kitchen from long ago. The last sunlight of the day on an old wall suddenly makes us remember our mother, our childhood, someone who has passed away. The inner life of a human being is not a building constructed from definitions. It is more like a garden that grows out of countless light touches from the world upon the senses and the heart. And here, Hume seems to understand human beings in a very gentle way. We are not cold machines of thought. We are creatures woven out of what we have seen, heard, tasted, loved, lost, and touched. Our memory is softer than reasoning. Our imagination is stronger than we usually suppose. What we call understanding is often nothing more than the weakened waves of our earliest collisions with life. This does not make knowledge small. On the contrary, it makes knowledge more real. It reminds us that if we wish to understand a human being, we should not ask only what they think. We should ask what they have lived through. We should ask what colors have passed before their eyes, what voices have remained with them, what pains have left their mark upon their nerves, what joys have lit some dark corner within them, for it is from such things that great ideas grow, as a tree grows from a seed. For Hume, philosophy therefore does not begin on the marble steps of an academy. It begins in a very humble place, a petal, a feeling of warmth in the hand, a sudden sound, a sorrow passing through the chest, a memory softened by the passing of years. And from such seemingly small things, he weaves a way of seeing the whole of the human mind. But then, once we have accepted that all knowledge begins from experience, a deeper question rises like dark water beneath moonlight. If we truly know only what we have felt, then how do we come to believe that tomorrow will resemble today? How do we know that fire will again be hot, that bread will again nourish us, and that the sun, like so many mornings before, will still rise slowly over the horizon. There are things we believe every day so naturally that we scarcely even notice that we are believing them. We go to sleep and simply assume that tomorrow morning the sky will grow light. We place the kettle on the stove and trust that the water will boil. We eat a slice of bread and do not pause to ask whether it will continue to nourish us, as it has so many times before. Human daily life is woven from countless small beliefs like these. Quiet, familiar, never needing to be spoken aloud. They're like the paving stones beneath our feet, so familiar that we forget we are walking on them. But David Hume, with his habit of looking closely at the things that seem most self-evident, gently asked a question at once simple and startling enough to make all philosophy pause. Why do we believe the sun will rise? At first hearing, the question almost sounds naive, for the sun has risen for generations. Morning after morning it returns, gently or brilliantly, after the long night. Day follows day, season follows season, and human beings wake, open the door and see the light pour in again as though the universe had signed with us a promise it would never withdraw. But Hume does not ask this to deny that regularity. He asks in order to touch the foundation of belief. What is it in reason that allows us to be certain that the future will resemble the past? And here, his answer is at once lucid and very gentle. According to Hume, when we say, "The sun will rise tomorrow," we do not truly possess an absolutely logical proof. We possess something else. Habit. We have seen the sun rise many times. We have witnessed an event repeated again and again, until the mind naturally joins yesterday to tomorrow with a familiar thread. From that repetition, belief appears, not like a theorem proved from above, but like a reflex woven into the depths of lived experience. In other words, we do not believe tomorrow will come, because reason has sealed off every other possibility. We believe that because the human mind is so constituted, it expects the continuation of what has happened many times before. This may seem small, but it is, in fact, very large, for it means that many things we call certain do not come from an immovable foundation, but from familiarity. We look at fire and believe it will give heat, because in our experience fire has always given heat. We see dark clouds and expect rain, because in memory dark clouds usually come with rain. We hear footsteps outside the porch and assume someone is about to enter, because that is how it has been so many times before. Life is able to function because of our capacity to turn repeated events into expectation. But, Hume softly reminds us, between what has happened and what will happen, there is no bridge of steel forged by logic. There is only a softer, more fragile bridge, the bridge of habit. Hearing this, many people may feel a chill. If everything is that fragile, does life become more uncertain? Is Hume taking away our last feeling of safety? Is he saying that nothing can guarantee tomorrow? But if we listen to him more closely, we see that Hume does not wish to drive human beings into despair at all. On the contrary, he is teaching us a very humane lesson. Be humble before what you call certain. Perhaps this is the true beauty of Hume's thought. He does not tell us to stop believing that the sun will rise. If he did, human life could scarcely continue. Nor does he advise us to tremble before the future. He simply wants us to understand the true nature of that belief. It is not some inviolable throne of reason, but a roof built from habit, experience, and the natural constitution of the human being. That roof is enough for us to live beneath it, enough for us to make breakfast, open the door, water the plants, write letters, and wait for loved ones to visit. But it also reminds us that life has never been a contract, stamped and sealed, guaranteeing that everything will repeat itself exactly as it did yesterday. And perhaps it is precisely here that Hume becomes closer to the human soul than many other philosophers. For our lives, especially once we have passed through many years, teach us that nothing has ever been wholly certain. There are mornings that seem ordinary and then turn out to alter an entire life. There are meetings we think will last, yet they vanish. There is health we imagine is still strong, until one day it suddenly weakens. There are sorrows that arrive without warning, just as there are comforts that come when we least expect them. If so, then knowing that tomorrow is not absolutely guaranteed may not be bad news at all. It may simply be a way of naming correctly the truth human beings have always lived beside. And once we name it correctly, the heart may become less arrogant, but also less afraid. We no longer imagine that we hold everything securely in our hands, and yet we go on living, go on trusting, go on placing our hands upon the small tasks of ordinary life. We believe the sun will rise not because we are gods who know every law, but because we are human beings, creatures who live by memory, by repetition, by the instinct to expect continuation. That truth makes our knowledge less magnificent, but it makes our life more real. That is the gentle lesson in Hume's Skepticism. He does not take away the morning. He merely removes some of our illusion about the morning. And when illusion grows lighter, we are able to greet the sunlight with greater gratitude, not as something absolutely guaranteed, but as something familiar that remains precious precisely because it was never truly promised to us alone. But then, once we have accepted that our belief in tomorrow is woven more from habit than from absolute certainty, a deeper question appears in the quiet darkness of the mind. Who is the one doing the believing? Who is the one who says, "I have seen, I remember, I wait"? When we turn inward and try to grasp that "I," do we touch some enduring core? Or do we find only a stream of sensations, memories, and passing thoughts, quietly flowing through one another like water under the moon? Perhaps there is no word human beings use more often than I. I remember. I am sad. I used to be that way. I am still the same person I once was. We say such things so naturally that we hardly ever stop to ask, what actually is that I? Where does it reside? Is it a stone lying still in the current of life, an unchanging core, a master seated deep within the mind, watching every sensation pass by? Or is it only a gentle name we give to something that is, in truth, moving without cease? David Hume, with his particular calm, entered that question without carrying axes or hammers. He did not rush in to shatter humanity's familiar sense of self. He simply did something very plain and also very difficult. He looked inward very carefully, and what he saw was not a self standing still, like a statue of stone. He saw one sensation following another, a thought flashing up and then vanishing. A memory appears, then fades away. A pain in the shoulder, a sound from the street outside, a passing joy at the recollection of an old face, a sorrow as thin as mist drifting across the heart. When we observe the mind, Hume says, we never catch a bear, I, separate, isolated, standing outside all experience. We catch only perceptions, sensations, thoughts, memories, impressions, emotions, arriving and departing, brightening and dimming, joining together into a stream. So when we say I, it may well be that we are naming a bundle of changing perceptions, rather than an unchanging substance standing behind them. At this point, many people may begin to feel slightly unsteady. Human beings naturally love the feeling of stability. We want to believe that beneath all the changes of age, illness, memory, joy, and sorrow, there is still some intact, solid self, untouched by time, somewhere in the depths. And indeed, that desire is very understandable, especially when life has passed through many seasons, when the face in the mirror no longer resembles the face from decades before, when those who once called our name in familiar voices have gradually fallen silent. The thought that there is still some unchanging I hidden deep within sounds deeply comforting. But Hume chose another image, even if he did not always speak in poetic language. The human being is not like a marble statue. The human being is like a river. Try to look at a river at dusk. The water is always flowing. The light upon its surface is always changing. One place glimmers, another darkens. A leaf falls upon it and drifts away. One ripple rises, and another takes its place. If we stand on the bank and call that river by name, we still feel it is one river. But if we bend down very close, we know that not a single drop of water stands still. What we call the river is really the continuity of motion, not the stillness of a fixed object. Hume looked at the self in much the same way. What makes us imagine ourselves to be one unified I is not that we directly touch some unchanging core, but that memory, habit, and imagination have stitched our scattered experiences together into a story that appears continuous. We remember who we were yesterday, and so we connect that self to who we are today. We keep the same name, the familiar face, the familiar voice, a few central memories, a few enduring relationships, and from these, the mind creates the feeling that there is a stable subject extending across many years. Here, Hume is not at all indifferent to human life. On the contrary, he seems to understand us all too well. We need that continuity in order to live, to love, to make promises, to bear responsibility, to tell the story of our lives. But what is necessary for life does not automatically become a certain metaphysical truth. The feeling that I am one may be very real psychologically, very necessary for morality and for human relationships, and still not necessarily prove that there exists an immutable self in any absolute sense. This unsettles many people, but it may also bring a strange kind of gentleness. For if we are a river, then perhaps we need not suffer so much when we see ourselves changing. We need not panic when we realize that at this age, we no longer think as we once did. We need not feel ashamed that some days the heart is clear, while on other days it is clouded. We need not despair when memory wears thin, emotions shift, and old beliefs fall away. A river does not betray itself by flowing. Flowing is precisely how it exists. Perhaps this is one of Hume's deepest and gentlest insights. A human being is not a thing meant to be frozen, but a life meant to continue. We do not have to remain unchanged in order to be real. We may change and still remain the same story, as a melody played through many instruments, at many tempos, in many seasons of light. And this, too, softens our hearts toward other people. If we ourselves are a stream of perceptions, then the person beside us is so as well. They are not merely a label, a fixed personality, an old mistake, or an image nailed in place many years ago. They, too, are changing, shaped by memory, injury, hope, fatigue, age, by things we know and things we do not know. From that perspective, Hume opens not only a philosophy of the self, but also a deeply human kind of tolerance, a little less rigidity in judgment, because neither we nor others are stone. We are water, But if the I is not a king sitting still in the castle of the mind, if within us there are only currents of perception, feeling, desire, and memory flowing through one another, then another question quietly arises. Among all those currents, what truly leads us onward? Is it reason, the faculty of which we are most proud, holding the helm? Or is there some force warmer, darker, closer to the earth, silently deciding the direction in which a human life will flow? If the human being is a river of perceptions, then what makes that river turn left or right? We like to think that we live by reason, that we weigh, compare, calculate, and only then act. That somewhere deep within, there is a lucid helmsman seated at the center of the mind, cool and precise, deciding every direction. That thought makes us feel steadier, higher, and in some measure more admirable in our own eyes. But David Hume, as usual, looks at the human being not in the way that makes us most proud, but in the way that comes closest to the truth. He believes that reason does not hold the helm alone. Indeed, in one famous line, Hume goes even further. Reason ought only to be the servant of the passions. At first hearing, this may trouble many people, for we are accustomed to placing reason high above, while passion sounds like something impulsive, uncontrolled, liable to pull a life away from the proper path. But if we slow down a little, we begin to see that Hume is not urging human beings to live blindly by emotion. He is simply pointing to a very ordinary truth. It is desire, feeling, fear, love, expectation, aversion, pity, pride, the longing for peace. These are what truly make us move. Reason may point out the tariq, but it does not itself create the legs that wish to walk. Consider something very small. A person knows perfectly well that walking every morning is good for health. They understand it. They can explain quite reasonably about blood pressure, joints, sleep, and old age. But whether or not they actually get out of bed the next morning is usually not decided by argument. It depends on a motive that is warmer and nearer, wanting to live longer in order to remain beside their grandchildren, wanting the body to feel lighter, wanting to keep a promise made to oneself, or simply loving the peace of early morning. Knowledge says, walking is good, but it is some emotional impulse that tells the body to get up. Hume sees the whole of human life in this way. Reason helps us see the relations between things. It tells us which road leads to which result. It tells us that fire gives heat, that a medicine may heal illness, that war will bring damage, and that saving money may help us through a time of hardship. But reason, by itself, cannot create the final purpose. It cannot generate love, fear, desire, aversion, the longing for safety, or the wish to be respected. It is more like a lamp illuminating the road than the source of energy that makes us want to set out upon it. So when a person chooses to remain and care for a loved one, rather than pursue a better opportunity for themselves, reason may help them organize the work, calculate the money, and weigh the consequences. But what truly makes them stay is likely love. When someone keeps a promise, though no one is forcing them, reason may tell them the benefits and losses, but what holds them to that promise is often honor, self-respect, and the feeling of not wanting to betray what they hold dear. When a person does something cruel, reason may help them carry it out more effectively, but what makes them want to do it is not reason. It is ambition, hatred, fear, or greed. Here, Hume does something very subtle. He frees reason from a burden that does not belong to it. We often blame reason when human beings behave badly, as though right thinking alone ought to make life right. But Hume reminds us that often the problem is not that we do not know what ought to be done, but that what drives us lies elsewhere. A person may clearly understand that drinking harms them and still go on drinking. They may know that anger will damage a relationship and still speak harshly. They may see that vanity is empty and still chase after it. That is not because reason does not exist, but because reason is not the sole monarch in the kingdom of the soul. If we understand this, we will have fewer illusions about human beings, but we will also become less harsh toward them. For many times we judge one another as though all anyone needed to do was simply think correctly. But real life rarely works so simply. There are people who know the right thing and yet do not have the strength to do it. There are people who know the wrong thing and are still driven toward it by fear. There are people who imagine they are choosing with the mind, while in truth, they are being steered in silence by some old wound. And so it is within ourselves as well. Many of the great choices in a human life, whom to love, what to remain loyal to, what to leave behind, whether to forgive or not, are almost never the product of reasoning alone. They grow from a place deeper, warmer, where the human being is at once most fragile and most true. This does not make the moral life meaningless. On the contrary, it makes the understanding of human beings more humane. For Hume, to live well does not mean eliminating passion until nothing remains but cold reason. That would be both impossible and undesirable. The real question is how to allow better feelings to grow larger within us. Benevolence instead of malice, composure instead of impulsiveness, simple joy instead of the kind of ambition that devours the heart. Reason remains very important. It helps us see consequences clearly, strip away illusion, and arrange the means. But the boat of a human life truly moves only when there is wind, and that wind, whether gentle or fierce, is often called passion. Perhaps that is why Hume never constructs the image of the human being as a god of perfect reasoning. He sees us as creatures who both think and feel, who can calculate, yet are also drawn along by what they love, fear, desire, and regret. That vision makes his philosophy less rigid, less proud, and far closer to life itself. But if it is passion that truly sets the human being in motion, then another question arises very naturally. What is it that makes us care for more than ourselves? Why can our hearts soften before the suffering of others, share in their joy, share in their sorrow, be moved by a fate far removed from our own? Amid the private desires of each individual, how is it that an invisible bridge is still built from one person to another, so that morality becomes not only a matter of rules, but also a quiet trembling in the human heart? There are things that are right that we do not need to learn through punishment in order to understand. We see an old person walking slowly across the street, hands trembling lightly in the early wind, and our first instinct is not to construct an argument. We simply feel our hearts soften. We hear that a child has lost her mother, or we look at a weary face after long years of illness, and before the mind has time to arrange its words, something in the chest has already stirred very gently. It is as though an invisible string has just been touched. Something within us trembles at the joys and sorrows of another person. David Hume looked at that moment very closely, and he believed that human morality begins there, not in rigid formulas, not merely in commands read aloud from on high, not in the fear of punishment, though such fear may still have some place in society. For Hume, if we wish to understand why human beings call one thing good and another bad, we must first look at a truth very close to life. The human heart knows how to tremble in response to another human being. He gave that capacity a very important name, sympathy, which we may understand as fellow feeling, or more deeply still, as the ability of one human heart to resonate with another. We do not always experience another person's pain exactly as our own, but we can feel some part of it. We can share in another's joy when we see them delivered from misfortune. We can feel sorrow when we see someone lost and alone. We can respect loyalty, be touched by gentleness, cherish generosity, and recoil at cruelty, pettiness, and treachery. This may seem so ordinary that it is easily overlooked, but in Hume's hands, it becomes a foundation of great importance. For if morality arises from the capacity to feel with others, then the human being is not merely a creature calculating private advantage. We are not sealed islands drifting across the sea of life. Between us and others, there are always fragile bridges, sometimes faint, sometimes obscured by prejudice, yet still there. Through those bridges, one person's joy can soften another person's face. Pain in some distant home can make a heart that has never entered that house grow quiet with sorrow. Here, Hume seems to have touched something very warm in human nature. We do not merely live beside one another, we also live through resonance with one another. And it is from that capacity for resonance that the moral qualities begin to shine. We value benevolence not only because it is right, according to a principle. We value it because when we witness it, life itself seems easier to breathe in. We love kindness not only because it is reasonable, but because it allows the heart to rest. We respect justice not only because it is necessary for order, but because we feel the beauty of a world in which human beings do not arbitrarily trample one another. What is very subtle in Hume is that he does not build morality upon an excessively grand image of the human being. He does not need to turn us into angels. He only needs to look very carefully at the ordinary, yet enduring tremors of life. A person helping a friend in hardship, a mother saving the best portion for her child, a stranger stops to help an elderly person who has fallen, a timely word of concern, a door held open for a few extra seconds, a sentence made a little less sharp so that someone will not be hurt more deeply. Such things do not shake history, but they make human life livable. And perhaps Hume understood that morality, before it is a theory, is the art of making life more livable for one another. From that perspective, we also understand why he placed such value on benevolence. For Hume, human beings do not admire only what is lofty in some dazzling sense. We also cherish what is useful and agreeable to shared life. A person who is gentle, trustworthy, considerate of others, able to restrain sudden anger, and able to be generous at the right moment. Such qualities make society less rough and jagged. They are not merely beautiful on paper, they are useful for human happiness. And that usefulness, in Hume's eyes, is not low or vulgar at all. On the contrary, it stands very close to the wisdom of life. At this point, Hume's philosophy carries a rare gentleness. He does not demand that human beings become perfect before they are worthy of esteem. He sees morality as a kind of light, warm enough to illuminate ordinary human relations. A smile at the right moment, patience with old age, a little mercy for a small mistake, a heart that knows how to soften before another's pain. To many philosophical systems that are too severe, such things may sound small, but to Hume, this is precisely where humanity breathes. And because he believed that morality begins with emotional response, Hume quietly reminds us of something deeply worth considering. A society may possess countless laws, countless sermons, countless slogans about right and wrong, but if the human heart dries out, then morality itself gradually becomes only an outer garment. By contrast, wherever the human heart still knows how to be moved, there remains hope for kindness. This is especially comforting when we look at a life filled with division, dispute, and harsh voices in any age. Hume seems to be saying that the deepest foundation of morality does not lie in which faction a person belongs to, which doctrine he reads, or how grandly he speaks. It lies in something far more basic. Whether we still see another person as human, as long as we still do, benevolence still has a door through which to enter. As long as we still do, cruelty cannot yet win completely. As long as we still do, morality is not dead. But then, from precisely here, another subtle question begins to emerge in the gentle darkness of Hume's thought. If kindness, sympathy, and much of the moral life can arise from such deeply human tremors, then what place is left for faith, for dogma, for stories of miracles? And when human beings tell one another of things that lie beyond ordinary experience, with what kind of heart should we listen, and with how much caution, so that we neither wound hope nor lose our honesty about what we have reason to believe? There are subjects that make voices rise even when touched only lightly. Religion is one of them, for there one finds not only arguments, one also finds consolation, fear, family memory, childhood, lost hope in the face of death, and those dark spaces through which reason is often not warm enough to help a person walk alone. And so, when a philosopher approaches faith, people often expect either the sound of kneeling or the sound of a fist striking the table. But David Hume did neither. He stood before religion in another way, calm, attentive, and almost deliberately keeping his voice low. Perhaps that is why his way of thinking about religion still carries such resonance today. Hume did not begin by asking what human beings ought to believe in order to be saved. He began with a question closer, quieter, and also more unsettling. Do we have sufficient reason to believe what we are believing? That question was not meant to overthrow all faith. It was more like a lamp brought near the stories human beings tell one another, especially stories of miracles, of interventions that exceed the ordinary order of the world. Let us try to think about a miracle in the way Hume wanted us to think. Someone says that the impossible has happened, that nature has changed its laws. An extraordinary event took place before someone's eyes. When we hear such a story, the mind stands between two possibilities. On one side is human testimony. On the other hand is the whole of our ordinary experience of how the world works. And Hume asks, between those two, which is more credible, not which is more beautiful, more comforting, or more desired to be true, but which carries the greater weight of evidence. Here, he offers a very lucid principle. A miracle, if it is truly a miracle, must be an event that runs contrary to humanity's regular experience of the laws of nature. But precisely for that reason, the evidence for believing it must also be strong enough to outweigh the force of countless experiences to the contrary. Put more simply, to believe that something extraordinary has truly happened, we must find that everyone reporting it being mistaken, remembering wrongly, embellishing, being carried away by emotion, or being swept along by the crowd is less likely than the miracle itself. That is a very demanding requirement. But it is not at all crude. Hume does not mock believers. He does not accuse them of stupidity. On the contrary, he understands very well why human beings are easily drawn to extraordinary stories. We are attracted by what is unusual. We like retelling what is out of the ordinary. We are easily moved by what awakens hope. The more astonishing a story is, the more likely it is to be remembered, passed along, and embellished further. Beyond that, religious belief does not grow in a vacuum. It grows within community, ritual, fear, and the longing to be sheltered from the fragility of life. Hume understood those motives too well to need to shout. Merely by pointing out that human beings are creatures inclined to believe what moves them emotionally, he caused the ground beneath many testimonies to tremble slightly. What is precious here is that he does not confuse two different things. First, respecting the spiritual needs of human beings. Second, treating every moving story as the truth. Hume seems to want to keep those two realms from collapsing into one another. A person may find comfort in faith. That is psychologically real, and at times, even beautiful. But the consoling power of a belief does not automatically turn that belief into something proven. This is where he stands very firmly, without insulting another person's hope, but also without allowing hope to take the place of evidence. That stance makes him a very different kind of skeptic. There are skeptics who wield reason like a weapon to humiliate others. Hume was not like that. He did not enjoy turning thought into a performance of the ego. In him, skepticism looks more like a discipline of honesty. When there is not enough reason to believe, he refuses to say, "I am certain, that is all," and that is all turns out to be immensely powerful, for it strips away the majestic garment that overly easy assertions so often wear. From there, Hume also suggests something deeper. Often the problem is not whether religion exists in human life, but what human beings say about religion, how they say it, and with what degree of certainty they say it. Fear, desire, imagination, tradition, the power of the church, the need to control a community. All these elements may enter into the telling, and once they enter, what is called sacred truth may also bear very earthly fingerprints. This is where Hume is especially sharp. He does not examine only the content of belief. He also examines the human mechanism by which belief is formed and transmitted. That is why, when he stands before religion, he does not stand there as a theologian, but as an observer of human nature. He looks at how fear can construct gods. He looks at how tradition can harden a story into dogma. He looks at how the crowd believes something not only because it is true, but because it makes life feel less cold. But it is also here that Hume's beauty becomes clearer than ever. After all that analysis, he still does not turn himself into a bitter man. His skepticism does not make him harsher toward human beings. Perhaps because he knows that behind many fragile beliefs are hearts that are themselves very fragile. And sometimes, what deserves criticism is not human weakness, but the systems that exploit that weakness in order to turn hope into an instrument of rule. So Hume stands before religion without raising his voice, because he does not need noise in order to do something greater. Teach human beings to distinguish between what we hope is true and what we have reason to believe is true. The distance between those two is very fine, but if we can preserve it, the mind becomes less fanatical and perhaps also kinder. In truth, this is not only a story about religion, it is also a story about every narrative human beings use in order to live. Stories of politics, stories of history, stories of honor, stories of the self, stories of the nation, stories of the past. Hume spent his entire life reminding us that human beings are guided not only by truth, but also by stories compelling enough to be believed. And then, after so many years spent living alongside reason, skepticism, history, and quiet arguments with his own age, that man would enter a very different final stage, where fame arrived late. Paris opened its doors, friends and rivals both came more sharply into view, and amid all the lights of society, he still preserved the rarest thing of all, a calm that did not need to defeat anyone in order to exist. There are people who, the more famous they become, the more rigid they grow. Fame comes to them like a suit of armor, brighter but heavier. They begin to defend themselves more, to suspect more, to fear more the loss of their image. But David Hume seems to have followed another path. The closer he came to the end of his life, when his name had already traveled beyond Scotland and England, the more he appeared as a kindly, warm, and likable man. As though, after all those years of skepticism, writing, debate, and enduring misunderstanding, what remained in him was not bitterness, but a gentle brightness of goodness. When he arrived in Paris, Hume entered a world very different from the quiet rooms of books or the solitary reflections of La Flèche. There were intellectual salons, nobles, men of letters, philosophers, long conversations under candlelight, laughter, sharp remarks that were not always cruel, and the brilliant minds of the Enlightenment seeking one another like stars in a sky full of motion. And within that setting, Hume, the broad-built Scotsman, with his kind face, unshowy bearing, slow voice, and tranquil smile, was loved in a way that was almost strange. The French called him Le Bon David, good David, kind David. It is a beautiful nickname. It praises him not first as a great thinker, but as a human being of gracious character. Perhaps because in an intellectual world that did not lack pride, did not lack vanity, and certainly did not lack sharp egos, Hume brought something rarer even than intelligence, a pleasing manner of presence. He did not need to make others smaller in order to appear greater himself. He did not need to raise his voice to prove his intellect. He did not turn skepticism into a whip. There was in him a generosity that made others feel at ease in his company. That says a great deal about his philosophy, even without naming a single concept. A man who spent his whole life pointing out the limits of reason, the fragility of belief, the confusion between habit and certainty, and who in the end became gentle and lovable. That is not a contradiction. It is proof that skepticism, rightly lived, does not dry out the heart. It can make the heart softer, less proud, less quick to judge. But life does not always repay kindness with peace. In one of the saddest stories of his final years, Hume opened his arms to help Jean-Jacques Rousseau, another great intellect of the age, but also a soul full of unrest. Rousseau, at the time, was surrounded by suspicion, conflict, fear, and a feeling of being pursued and betrayed. Hume, with sincere goodwill, helped him find refuge in England, helped arrange the conditions of his life, and helped him through the natural kindness of his own heart. If one looked at it only through the logic of self-interest, it was a troublesome matter Hume could easily have avoided. But kindness does not always calculate in that way. It often acts before it has time to weigh and measure. Then something painful happened. Rousseau, in the thickening fog of his anxiety, began to suspect Hume himself. Help was read as a conspiracy. Kindness was interpreted as design. A relationship that might have been beautiful between two great minds dissolved instead into the darkness of fear and paranoia. And here, Hume appears truly as Hume. He was hurt, he was saddened, he responded, but he did not become cruel simply because he had been treated unjustly. He saw very clearly something that perhaps he had spent his whole life learning to see. Human beings do not live by reason alone. Often they are led by silent wounds they themselves cannot control. So the story between Hume and Rousseau, if we look deeply enough, is not merely a personal rupture. It is like a living illustration of Hume's own philosophy of human nature. We do not always act according to what is most reasonable. We do not always treat well those who have been good to us. We carry within us too many fears, too many old shadows, too many passions and anxieties to remain as clear as we would like. And because Hume understood that, he seems not to have turned to stone before the failings of others. The nearer he came to the end of his life, amid belated honors and the weariness of the body, the more brightly that quality shone in him, a serene kindness. When illness drew near, Hume did not turn his final days into a stage for tragedy. He still conversed with friends, still preserved his composure, and could even smile with a lightness that astonished those around him. The people near him saw something rare. Here was a man who had thought so deeply about the limits of the human being, yet when standing before the greatest limit of all, death, he did not cry out, did not perform, did not cling desperately to final certainties. Perhaps it was precisely then that the whole of Hume's spiritual life closed into a beautiful circle. The boy who grew up amid dogma did not die inside dogma. The young man who once collapsed from forcing himself to live against his nature did not grow old in bitterness. The philosopher who had stripped away illusion layer by layer from reason did not end as a cold man. On the contrary, he departed with the simplest and most enduring of things, a lucid mind and a heart that had not grown cruel because of what it had learned about the world. His close friend, Adam Smith, would later write of Hume with particular reverence, not only for his intellect, but for the quality of his character. And perhaps that is the finest memorial of all. After all the books, debates, fame, misunderstandings, and years, what remained of Hume was not only the ideas that changed the direction of philosophy. What remained was also the image of a man who understood human beings very clearly and still chose to be gentle with them. That is a quieter victory than any political triumph. And when that final smile came to a close, Hume's story seemed unwilling to stop in the 18th century. It is more like a lamp set once again before the door of our own age, an age also full of noise, full of excessive certainty, full of anxieties hidden beneath grand assertions. In that gentle light, the questions Hume left behind are still awake. How to live amid uncertainty without panic, how to doubt without losing compassion, and how to keep the mind clear while the heart remains soft enough to rest peacefully in a world that has never truly ceased from trembling. Let your breathing slow a little. Slow like the lamp in the room has just been turned down one notch lower. Still bright enough for us to see the way, yet gentle enough that the heart does not have to remain awake too long with the agitations of the world. Breathe in as though you were inviting stillness to enter. Breathe out as though you were gently seeing off the noises of a long day through the door, the endless stream of headlines, the overly certain assertions, the cold brightness of screens, the tireless arguments, the worries that sometimes arrive faster than their own names. And now, as the story of David Hume has nearly completed its circle, we return to the year 2026, our own age. An age very bright, very fast, full of data, full of opinions, and also full of weariness. We live amid countless promises of certainty. Algorithms promise to know what we want. Screens promise to give us answers instantly. Loud voices promise to explain the world through a few brief slogans. But the longer one lives, the more one understands a simple truth that is not always comforting. Real life has never been so obedient. Perhaps the first lesson Hume offers this age is a lesson in humility before the unknown. He does not tell human beings to give up thinking. Still less does he advise us to live in vagueness. What he reminds us is simply this: be careful with things that seem too certain. For many things we imagine to be motionless truths are, in fact, only habits repeated for long enough, beliefs shared by a community often enough, stories told attractively enough that we no longer wish to doubt them. Our year 2026 is lacking in that. Lacking in the humility of intellect. Everyone is quick to conclude. Everyone wants to be right. Everyone is tempted to believe that their side possesses the whole of the light, while the other side consists only of darkness. But Hume would remind us very softly that human beings are more fragile than their own declarations. We see the world through limited experience, imperfect memory, passing emotions, and the habits of the mind. To know this is not to despair. It is to become less aggressive when saying, "I am certain." Sometimes a society does not fall apart because it lacks intelligence, but because it has too much confidence. And here, Hume teaches us a rare gentleness. We do not need to know everything in order to live decently. We do not need to solve every mystery in order to sleep peacefully. On some nights, what saves the heart is not a final answer, but the capacity to accept that life will always retain some misty region, and that we may still walk slowly through that mist with a small lamp in our hand. Hume's second lesson, perhaps even closer to us, is a lesson about emotion. The modern age likes to think of itself as rational. We speak of data, strategy, efficiency, and intelligent decisions. But Hume saw very early what we still so often forget today. Reason does not hold the helm alone. Human beings do not live by argument alone. We live by fear, affection, pride, habit, the desire to be recognized, the need to feel safe, and also by old wounds that sometimes even we ourselves do not know how to name. This explains a great deal about the world of 2026. Why do arguments grow hotter and hotter? Why do people more easily believe what makes them angry than what requires patience? Why do they know one thing to be right and yet still live by what is wrong? Why are there those who appear strong on the outside, but inwardly are only afraid? Hume would say, because the human being is, first of all, a creature that feels, and only afterward, a creature that reasons. Hearing this, perhaps we should become less severe with one another, and also less deluded about ourselves. It is not enough to have the better argument in order to overcome pain. It is not enough to understand what is right in order to live rightly. There are things we can only begin to change once the heart has first been soothed, once fear has been named, once the human spirit has been treated with a little patience. That is why Hume's lesson does not belong only to philosophy. It belongs to families, to friendships, to old age, to those years in which human beings learn how to speak to one another more gently. For the farther we move toward the end of life, the thing that often preserves relationships is not eloquence, but the ability to understand one another's feelings without wounding them further. And from there, Hume opens a third lesson. Perhaps the most precious lesson for an age so easily polarized. Tolerance. Tolerance, in Hume's light, is not weakness. It does not mean saying that all opinions are right, that all beliefs are equal, or that every act deserves forgiveness. No. Tolerance here begins from a deeper recognition. Because we ourselves are limited, we must learn to hold our judgments with a gentler hand. Once we understand that human belief is often woven from habit, circumstance, fear, memory, and the stories people were raised with, we become less surprised by their errors. Once we understand that we, too, are guided by emotion and by invisible blind spots, we become less enchanted by the role of judge. Once we understand that no one possesses the whole of the light, we begin to see dialogue as more valuable than victory. The age of 2026 is in great need of that kind of tolerance. Not the loose kind of tolerance that loses all standards, but the kind mature enough to know that human beings are rarely simply right or wrong. They are more often a mixture of understanding and blindness, kindness and selfishness, clarity and unrest. Hume himself, after seeing so many illusions of humankind, still did not become a bitter man. That may be his most beautiful victory. He understood human beings very clearly, yet still chose to be gentle with them. Perhaps that, too, is the final lullaby he leaves us. In a world too full of noise, we do not need to shout louder in order to become profound. In an age where everyone wants certainty, we may choose humility. In a society that worships reason, we may remember to care for the heart. In an atmosphere so easily divided, we may preserve tolerance as we preserve a small flame in the night. And perhaps by doing so, we will live a little more lightly, less compelled to win every argument, less compelled to prove ourselves right in every moment, less compelled to demand that life explain everything, only bright enough not to lose our way, soft enough not to turn to stone, and peaceful enough that, when night falls, we may lay our head upon the pillow with a mind that has finally stopped fighting the whole uncertainty of the world. Out there, the year 2026 will still be full of wind. But here, in this gentle darkness, between one slow breath and a story just brought to its close, perhaps David Hume is still whispering to us in his deep and distant voice that we do not need to hold everything with certainty in order to live honorably. We do not need to understand human beings completely in order to love them, and we do not need to defeat every doubt in order to rest in peace.